Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be back with ADAMA for this artist salon. This edition is the 12th. I can't believe that it's been 12 weeks since the first time I was asked to join. I'm so happy to be back again this afternoon with these incredible artists, Raianna C. Brown, Rashayla Marie Brown, Basil Kincaid, and Nyugen Smith. Of course, all of these artists are based in performance and really working from different places and accessing so much of our history through their work. So typically how we do this, if you're new, we have each artist sort of speak on their practice. Some may share images or video. And then at the end, we come together again to have a conversation about the tangents and ties and connections between all of their work. Of course, as always, there's a Q&A section toward the bottom of your screen. If you have questions, feel free to enter them there. Also, we love a lively chat. So please feel free to, engage with us in the chat box as well. So excited. It's such a good time. What an incredible time to be alive. There's so much change that our people are pushing forward in the world at this moment. So I'm looking forward to having this conversation. So we'll start with you, Raianna. Raianna C. Brown exhibits the dynamism through her disciplinary work. She is the founder of Komanse Dance Theater. Komanse sold-out shows integrate technology and the arts. The shows centered on the narratives of marginalized people using technology amplify the performance. Raianna's other accomplishments in the world of dance include choreographing commissioned pieces for the NAACP, the Atlanta's Mayor's Office, Grammy-nominated artists, and international dance companies, and dancing alongside Shakira at Super Bowl. I don't know Roman numerals anymore. LIV. The last one.
Super Bowl 1 million.
I was like, ooh, words that mean numbers. I don't know anymore. Okay, Raianna has been featured in Teen Vogue, Elle, and has been interviewed on NPR about her work combining social activism, engineering, and the arts. We're super excited to have you, and I'm so excited to hear what you have to say.
Yes, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Feel free to talk us through your process.
Oh, got it.
What you do, how you do it.
Okay.
What you hope to accomplish, do that.
Okay. So I, like she mentioned, I am the artistic director and founder of Komanse Dance Theater. So Komanse is a professional dance company in Atlanta. We focus on creating work that is very Black, just in general. Our company is mixed race and cultures. However, we do focus on telling Black stories. Our most recent show we did, Skid, was focused on homelessness and gentrification in the city of Atlanta. And so we try to make sure, and I try to make sure that the work that I create is pertinent to the things going on in the world around me right now, but also having some form of community activism or community service integrated with our work. So for our last show, we partnered with the Covenant House, which is a local shelter here in Atlanta that serves at-risk youth. And so we taught dance classes there and also volunteered with some of the youth there. But we also interviewed them to get some of their stories and make sure that the show that we were creating was an accurate depiction of their experience, versus a lot of times marginalized people are seen as a monolith or only capable of experiencing one thing. So if you are experiencing homelessness, that's it, and you're sad and you're upset, or that's all you're allowed to feel, versus the reality is that people who are experiencing oppression, whether it's homeless people or Black people or whoever, they experience a full range of emotions. So the goal of our work with Komanse is to create a space where that humanity can be not only shown, but also honored and revered with like the ordinary things. Like she also said, I went to Georgia Tech, so I live a double life as an engineer and a software developer. And so we integrate technology a lot into our shows, trying to create a symbiotic relationship between the tech and the art so that they feel complementary versus one outshining the other. So the first show that I did, we used projection mapping, and we worked with the Industrial Design School at Georgia Tech to create an environment that changed as the dancers moved it. And there was artwork projected on the set. So that was really, really exciting to see that integration of technology and the arts. And then our second show, Skid, that I did with Come On Say, we partnered with a Black 3D printed fashion designer, Shami Oshun, and she created costumes that had 3D printing on them. So we always try to create like something that involves Black people, activism, and technology. And that's kind of the goal. So that's like the quick overview of what I do.
Fantastic. I'm wondering if you have images or video that maybe you can show us at some other time.
Yes, let me try to pull them up.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I'm excited to see the 3D printed costumes, especially.
Yes, let me find them. Someone else can go while I find them.
Yeah, okay, cool.
I'm sorry.
No worries. So,
Okay.
Rashayla, it's on you now. Rashayla Marie Brown's signature undisciplinary studio practice manifests in installation, photography, video art, film, performance, and writing. R&B, as she's affectionately known, has presented work at venues internationally such as La Bec, La Tour de Pelise, MCA Chicago, MOAD San Francisco, the Tate Modern in London, and Turbine Hall, Johannesburg, among others. Grants include Chicago Artadia Award, New York City's Franklin Furnace, which is, if you know, one of the sort of highest awards in performance art, the U.S. Department of Education's FLAS for Arabic, the Mandela Washington Fellowship Reciprocal Exchange Program in Zimbabwe, and the Mayor of Atlanta's Film Grant, among others. At the School of Art Institute of Chicago, R&B served as the inaugural director of diversity and is currently assistant professor adjunct. Actually, is that still accurate? I know you just, okay. I know she just got a promotion. We're all very excited for her. Simultaneously working on 2 film projects as part of Northwestern University's Performance Studies Department. I'm super excited to talk with you. I actually just reached out to you about talking. And
I know.
So it's like, we still have so much to talk about still. I'm very excited to do so. And of course, I think we share a mentee as well. Or maybe she was your student and she's my mentee.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say. I was like,
you're like, oh really? Amazing.
I try to be very conscious of how I promise things to younger people.
I know that's right. I know that's right.
You know.
Okay, well, please talk to us about what you're working on, what you're thinking through, where your practice finds its roots, all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me and inviting me, Fahamu. Thank you, Niama, for moderating this panel, and thank you to all of the co-panelists, because I think we all represent very diverse and different approaches to the concept of performance. So I wanted to kind of speak a little bit about that. So my approach to performance is mostly through the lineage of what would be called like conceptual art. So thinking specifically about conceptual performance, what I'm doing is not theater, not performing arts, not dance, but something that is using my body as a way of trying to create questions about what the form of art actually is and whether or not it should be perceived as something that is interactive with another person or something that uses my body as the medium and the tool, or if the dialogue itself is the actual artwork after the life of the actual event of the performance itself. So a lot of my work is really critical in thinking about the intertwining of questioning medium, questioning audience, and questioning the form of discipline. And so that's the reason why I use the term undisciplinary, because I'm really thinking a lot about how to undo the boundaries between disciplines and how a lot of times those have been institutionally inscribed. And since I'm working within mostly museums and galleries with my artwork, I'm speaking a lot to a very elite audience and getting them out of their complacency. Hopefully that's my goal in order to question how Black people, how femme people, how queer people, how women are showing up in these type of spaces and how their bodies are being commodified. So a lot of my work is thinking about that. Also because I'm a person of African descent with really light skin, a lot of my work is also talking a lot about what it means to take my light skin privilege and like kind of trick people and flip them into situations that they didn't expect, kind of in the same vein of the very famous and influential performance-based artist, Adrienne Piper. Can't pass for white. My work doesn't go all the way to the end that her work goes to, but I do oftentimes try to incorporate those types of questionings and trickeries and slipperies in my work. So that's kind of the background. What I tend to work on is a combination of works that extend they have a life that extends over time. So I will, let's see if I can do this share screen thing, because I'm just going to go to my website. If people want to go on the website, they can do that. But it's basically just to show you some images of how like a work starts as a certain kind of art piece and then it travels into other media. And so that's where the undisciplinary thing happens. I start with a medium, I go to the next, and it's the same concept and it just keeps developing. So let me just show one project that I think a lot of people would be familiar with. Okay, so Rage to Master is probably my most famous performance-based piece, where I had a group of artists kind of collaborating with me, including Nick Kay, who's based in New York. What we did was, as a part of Kerry James Marshall's retrospective at the MCA, I presented kind of like a projection of different images of Black folks, whether they are on some kind of queer spectrum or Black women, as outside of the canon of art histories, true to the nature of Kerry James Marshall's work, which is always talking about how Black people show up in the canon. And since all of my co-participants were queer folks or women, we were all kind of in solidarity, multiracial group, but mostly Black, kind of processing with images of my body outside of the museum. And I actually burned the objects, which are kind of a representation of my entire artistic practice. And then I recite a contract that's in tribute to Delia, who was an enslaved person who was photographed as one of the, I think this is one of the oldest known photographs of an enslaved person. And now what I've done as a part of Rage to Master is actually find a descendant of Delia's father, Renty, who is now suing Harvard for ownership of the daguerreotypes that these are depicting them in a very abject state. So what I recently just did was actually host, and I'll just take people to this real quick, a talk on my Twitch account where I essentially interviewed, I'm sorry, I'm just gonna pull this up real quick. Yeah, I interviewed Tamara Lanier, who's a descendant of Renty, about her battle against Harvard. So that's kind of like, for me, how performance manifests as a multi kind of dimensional artwork. So it starts with these types of performances where, you know, I might be using a certain set of images. Oh, sorry, I'll mute that. And then I'll try to find a way to extend the life of that through further engagement and conversation. So, yeah, so I won't take up too much more time after that, but that's just to give you a sense of what I'm into.
Well, that was amazing. And I think that was a really incredible sort of whetting of our appetite, so to speak, in terms of getting us primed to have a conversation together about the ways that there are so many intersections in what you all are doing. So next, we have Basil Kincaid. Basil, born in 1986, is a post-disciplinary artist from St. Louis, Missouri. Kincaid studied drawing and painting at Colorado College, graduating in 2010. Kincaid has exhibited work nationally and internationally with Kavi Gupta Gallery, Mindy Solomon, Kravitz Webby, and Carl, I'm sorry, I probably am not going to pronounce this correctly, Kostial? Yeah? Okay. Kincaid also has work in the JP Morgan Permanent Collection. Recently, Kincaid debuted their first museum performance at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation in St. Louis, Missouri. Kincaid's work primarily focuses on legacy, intimacy, reclamation, healing, labor, quilting, and self-harmony. Kincaid has upcoming shows this July in Belgium at Stems Gallery, curated by Pascaline Smets, and in November in Rome with Galleria Anna Mara, curated by Larry Osei Mensa. Shout out to Larry. Basil, I'm so excited to see your face. So excited to hear from you.
Too, yeah. So my engagement with performance, sorry, I was like putting this on the live and I dropped my phone. I started with performance, started doing street performance with some of my friends here in St. Louis. And I'm actually interested in getting back into performing on the street. So I'm like training for some new performances. Pretty much all of my performance art is like an extrapolation of activities or rituals in my everyday life. So I'll take some practice that I may have in my life and then filter it through the world of the quilt and magnify it. So like the idea is like taking these like everyday features of Black life and using them as ways to recall and call us back into these like just timeless states of being, you know, where we were nurturing ourselves and in harmony with ourselves and, you know, connecting either with yourself or with other people. So I wonder if while I talk, I can pull up the, okay.
We love images. Do it.
Okay, so this is a performance. And so I guess my earliest performances in 2016 started where like it would be me and a group of other people performing and the audience would kind of watch it happen. And then I pretty quickly shifted away from that where like all of the performance, there's nobody watching, like you're in it happening. And so this is like, we had one documented session, so it could be documented, but most of the performance work is undocumented. You know, I make people, well, I don't like the way of saying that, but no one has a phone. It's kind of like you're just there with it happening. So this was like an extension of like, sorry, I had to take a deep breath. I get excited. This was like basically like a multi-stage meditation. So like it started with like a breathing and movement component that was led by two women that are both like Black Reiki masters here in St. Louis, practitioners. And then so my friend and artist Damon Davis and I made a meditation tape that was like the primary audio component. There were olfactory components with herbs that were grown by a friend of mine. So it's like looking at like this connection to the earth, connection to each other, and then using the quilts kind of as this like timeless portal where we can like commune with like this collective of like, I don't know, I feel like there's like a pool of like energy that we can all source into. So part of it was like a procession. And this was the first time like doing one of the performances in a museum setting. They're normally either in an environment or on the street. So that was like a little different. But I do a lot of performances that have no audience. You know, like I may do a ritual that's just for myself. And I feel like that is like where performance art can become like a powerful part of your daily life. I mean, we could talk more from there, but basically I try to think about like, how can I extrapolate these different parts of my like self-healing practice to share that with other people and expand it with other people. You know, and I'm interested in some performances that are like just for Black people, but I'm also interested in like collective healing, because whether we recognize it or not, this system is like entrapping everybody, even though, you know, I feel like it's entrapping everybody, except for like maybe a very small percentage of like hyper wealthy people. But I feel like white people are just as enslaved as we are. They just have like a different type of trauma that comes from it. But that's a whole different conversation. So yeah, that's in a nutshell, my performances are like, oh, I like to exfoliate. Let me exfoliate on the street. I know that there's more to it than that, but you know. that's a start.
Yeah, that was so great. Thank you. And there's a lot of threads I'm gonna pull on. No pun intended there.
Yeah.
Nyugen, you're up. Nyugen E. Smith is a first-generation Caribbean-American interdisciplinary artist and educator living and working in Jersey City, New Jersey. Responding to the legacy of European colonial rule in the African diaspora, his work considers imperialist practices of oppression, violence, and intergenerational trauma. He is interested in ritual and sacred practice rooted in African spiritual systems and how they are employed tools for collective empowerment. He holds a BA from Seton Hall University and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. His exhibitions, public programs, visiting artist lectures include Perez Art Museum Miami, the Schomburg Center in Research in Black Culture, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Museum of Latin American Art, Museum of Cultural History in Norway, Indigo Arts Alliance, and Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Awards include the Lenore Annenberg Performing and Visual Arts Fund, Franklin Furnace Fund, Joan Mitchell Foundation Painters and Sculptors Grant. Super excited to see you again today. You are on mute still. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thank you, Famu, for having me today. And glad to be in the company of all the other panelists today. It's wonderful. So this is exciting to get a chance to kind of talk about the performance practice this entire time during this pandemic and all of the other things that have been kind of compounded on top of that. It's been a really challenging time, and I did not foresee myself being in a space where I'll be able to actually talk about work, talk about artwork. So I'm glad that we're all collectively have gotten to this point, because I'm sure that many of us have gone through our own personal struggles with everything that's going on this time. So blessings on us getting here, right? And so I started performance in a way to kind of think about performance as another medium, where I was working through painting, started as a painter, and then moved into making sculpture. And when I started to see performance happening, it was something that I resonated with as growing up, being in a home where spiritual practice was definitely emanated through the body. And it was one of those things when I started to see performance happening, I started to reflect back on these actions that I had grown up seeing and not necessarily understanding what the actions meant, but knew that the actions held something deeper. And so when I began engaging in performance, it was less out of any kind of trajectory or legacy of quote unquote performance art, but mainly through exploring ideas through the way that my body processed it and then put it out into the public. And so it definitely had a lot of the sounds, a lot of the movements, a lot of the energy, a lot of the repetition. These are some of these things that existed in the spiritual practice that I had grown up seeing, and it just naturally started to happen and fold itself into the way that I was thinking about making performance. And so through that time, I started to think about hearing people, when they would see my performances, especially people who have been seeing performances all the time. I was like, they would say to me, "Oh, your performance is like theater. You're I don't know if this is performance art. I don't know. It's kind of like theater." And for a while that it kind of bothered me in the beginning, because I was thinking to myself, well, I was a little bit confused by it, to be honest. It was me wondering, why is this considered theater when I was viewing this very different from theater, because I also had a theater background. And so I started to just say, you know what, I believe that I need to just focus on the way that I'm seeing this as performance and follow that path and find others who are along that similar trajectory, people I can learn from that are working with similar ideas and concepts, etc. And so I'll share some images here. And this was this first set. Can you see this? Yeah, okay. I'm just gonna just one image, right? You can see it. So this image here is was from a performance that I did at the Queen's Museum, where they asked a few different artists to come to the museum and respond to a contemporary Indian art exhibition that was there. And so I went, and the first object was this boat by Subhra Gupta, and the boat is called "What Does the River Hold That This Boat Does Not?" And the first thing that it resonated with me, because I also did a really large boat sculpture. And so immediately the imagery and the contents of the boat being found objects, because I use found objects in my work, I really, really connected with this. And I spent some time with it, and I just really started to think about this boat as the vessel, and equated that to the body as the vessel. And so one of the next things that happened was, when I was looking at the title, I was thinking, well, what does this boat hold that my body doesn't hold? As opposed to what does this boat hold that the river does not, which is the actual title. So I was thinking about India as a colonized place. India is colonized by the British. So was Trinidad and Tobago, where my mother's side of the family is from. So in this performance here, I started to use to mimic the boat. So what I did here, you can see I have a Sharpie here. So what I'm doing is actually drawing the lines that I see on the boat here. So this is a separation between the planks on the boat. So I started to draw a line down my body as the boat does. And then I used artist tape, because the boat, with these planks are also connected by these kind of staples. So I then used the tape to kind of staple my body here, and then started to perform a series of different actions to continue to become the boat, to become laden like the boat. So using objects that I've created, objects that I use in sculpture, and other objects that I use in performance, I started to weigh my body down, as well as having members, people who were there to witness the performance, also load my body up. Similarly, as in thinking about the way that the European colonizers have laid in the body and weighted the bodies of Black people throughout time. The next image here is from a performance that I did in, this one took place in Miami, and this performance is titled "Lest We Forget." And this was my first collaborative performance with a good friend of mine, Marvin Fabian, who's from the island of Dominica and now lives in Martinique. And through meeting him in 2017, when I went to Martinique, we continued our dialogue about the Caribbean, continued our dialogue about climate change in the Caribbean and the way that we see the future of the Caribbean and how we think about performance. He primarily works in sound, but he's also an interdisciplinary artist. And so when I had the opportunity to show at Prism Art Fair in 2017 in Miami, they asked me to make a performance. And in my thinking about the continued collaboration with other people in the Caribbean and kind of offering opportunities for creating opportunities for other artists in the Caribbean as well, I invited Marvin to collaborate on this, developing this project. So this is really thinking about the impacts of hurricanes in the Caribbean and the future of climate change in the Caribbean. So this was, we had these tarp suits designed to wear these suits, as tarp being the symbol that of a recognizable symbol for those who are in some sort of disaster area, relief area for protection, etc. And members of the people who were there to witness the performance were holding these ropes. So it's like batten down the hatches, holding things down, but also feeling is in the way that the colonial constructs have been a sort of a hindrance and holding down the progression of the Caribbean as a region. And this performance was another collaborative work. We continue this collaborative project, Lest We Forget, and this one took place in Puerto Rico, and this was in a former military arsenal. So we always tap into the history of the spaces in thinking about what the space held, what was the purpose of the space, and what is the current time. So this particular performance involved thinking about this was post Hurricane Irma and Maria. So at that point in time, there was this push by the Ministry of Tourism to bring people back to Puerto Rico for tourism. But yet there were many people still suffering on the island, still didn't have access to water and electricity and everything, but they were telling potential tourists that everything was okay. And the sound that's created is evoking the movement. It's helping to drive me as I move, as well as I'm responding, as well as he's responding to my movements as well. Speeches have become a big part of the performance too. So language. So what I do oftentimes with these performances is that I'm taking excerpts from different interviews, news reports and such related to this very specific issue that we're addressing in the performances. And I combine that with original poetry, and that's performed during the performance as well. This performance here that you're looking at was our latest performance, the largest one to date at the Perez Museum. This happened last December, and it's called After the Fracture. And that's in relation to the exhibition that just came down that I was in, called The Other Side of Now: Foresight in Contemporary Caribbean Art, where they asked us to think about the future of the Caribbean outside of quote unquote doom and gloom. So this was in relation to the work that I have there in thinking about the Caribbean region shifting away after some sort of major tectonic event. And now all of the islands that were once separated by bodies of water are now together in one landscape. And so as a result of that, new customs, new language, new folklore, new traditions begin. So this performance took place outdoors, and it became that shared imaginary space. Right? So I'll stop there.
I'm excited. Thank you for that. Hey, Deborah. Hello to everyone who's just joining us. Again, we have 4 incredible performance-based artists with us, joining us today for the ADAMA Art Salon. So those 4 are Raianna C. Brown, Rashayla Marie Brown, Basil Kincaid, and Nyugen Smith, who, if you've had the privilege of being with us since the beginning, we just heard Nyugen speak. So in this moment, I want us to all come back together and speak to each other about our own practices and the connections and the ways that there's so much overlap, and the ways that there aren't, because there are a lot of ways that what each of you are doing are very much accessed from a much different place. But one of the things that I noticed as I listened to all of you speak, it seems that identity, authenticity, and futurity are at the center of what all of you are doing. And so I just wonder if you can walk us through the sort of specific ways that you parse through those ideas and those elements in your practice.
Can I jump in? Okay, cool. Yeah, I had an idea and I was like, let me jump in here before I forget it. And when you think, when you mention like identity, and when I imagine the meaning of the word futurity, I mean, like, how does this extend into the future? Yeah. Okay. So when I started doing performance artwork, that time period in my life, I wasn't feeling much intrinsic value. Like, most of the value that I felt in my life in 2016, maybe early 2017, it had been years like in this gradual kind of self-degradation where like all I was really caring about was work. I realized like I wasn't doing any behaviors that were nurturing of myself. Like, yes, I had work ethic. Yes, I had drive. Like, yes, I would study and hustle and do whatever it took to make my art work, but I wasn't doing as much of my own internal work. And I guess in the performances, it made it where like my self-care could be something I could prioritize, because I could trick my twisted mind into I'm doing art now, so I can take this time to like take care of myself, because it's like I'm making art is for me. And then that led to all these different series of collaborative performances, and some performances that were just for photographic documentation. But what ended up happening over the process was that I did trick myself into caring more about myself and shifting the priorities, where I can put myself before the artwork and let the art be an extension of me rather than me being like a caricature of myself as a face for, I don't know. But basically what performance kind of did for me was like, it gave me at first a reason to dig deeper into my own ritual life and my own like personalized spiritual ritual experience, because like all of the study, all of this private study work that would lead up to a public performance was me learning how to care for myself. And so, you know, I don't know how to put it into art words, but you know, it was this
All
cycle.
words are art words.
Okay, that's a good way. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's a good way to put it. Like, it was kind of a fake it till you make it. Like, I wanted to make art about healing. I ended up accidentally starting to like do the work of healing myself. And then I ended up shifting and getting to put that first. And then like now I feel so much more alive, and like I enjoy making all my other art more because it's coming from a different source of energy. And so I feel like, you know, whether or not some of these performances were private or public or audience or no audience, engaging with like practicing a thing in terms of like as an activity or a behavior or a performance, if you want to call it performance, it got me to shift the way I think about like the behaviors in my daily life and like my engagement with myself. So like, you know, you perform, it's kind of like your higher self watching your body self. And then they ended up having this kind of conversation for me. So in a nutshell, that's like how like I started the identity piece, and then what it led into now, which is now fueling the work that I make in the future. It's like expanding on this. So did that make sense?
Yes, Basil.
Okay.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Okay. So I think you said something about authenticity in your statement as well. So for me, that's probably one of the most important parts of when I'm creating work, because in dance a lot, you can have very showy movement where it's like, how high can I get my leg, or how can I make this exciting? And I had a lot of teachers who said, once you start looking at the dancer's skill or how nice their feet point, then you've lost your audience because you're not really saying anything. You're looking at like their physical ability, and you could find someone who doesn't dance who may be even better than them. And so when it came to figuring out this idea of how to be authentic, the very first show that I was the artistic director of was called Inhuman, and it was focused on, sorry, I have notes because I can't keep my ideas straight, so that's what I'm reading from. But the first show I did was focused on hip hop and why it sounds the way it does versus like classical music or Eurocentric music, and specifically hip hop and jazz, which are very like African American musical sounds, and why those are often seen as less refined, especially when it comes to putting them on like a stage with dancers. That's not something that you're supposed to do, or even having lyrics in your songs, like that's taboo when it comes to creating concert dance. And so I'm from Atlanta, and I like listening to music like Soulja Boy, and like, so like that's the music I grew up on. And so it brought into question, like, why can't you put that on stage with dancers and it still be just as important? And then by focusing on hip hop, it brought me to this idea of like keeping it real, which is something that's extremely important in like that culture, and especially Black culture as well. And so the question became, how do I keep my movement authentic versus just something to please the audience and entertain? Like, how do you keep it authentic? And so the way that I started doing that is I start with like one idea, usually isn't the main idea that I end up with later. And then I kind of brain map it out. I have one in my room actually that I can show you guys. How do I fit my camera? Okay, so this is a start of a new one, but this is kind of how it looks. This one started with, I think, returning home is where this one started. And then it just kind of spans out. It's pretty new, so it's kind of empty right now. But that's kind of how I get from an idea to movement. So the most recent show we did, Skid, like I said, was focused on homelessness. And so to give you an idea of how that tracks is, when I was thinking about homelessness, I got to this thing of not being able to relax, like not being able to feel in your own space or in control, or always kind of being on your toes. And so from there, I came up with, I'm moving so much, but I came up with movement that was kind of staple in our show, where the dancers moved like this, either like by themselves or in a unit. And so that's kind of how the idea of Skid jumps to movement, but it's still connected. So what's the most important for me is like, why am I doing this movement? And sometimes I can't conceptualize it, but I can feel when it's correct, because I am able to look at like the crazy brain map that I created, and that'll drive me to movement. Turn my paper. And then you said something about identity. And so I find that as I'm creating and uncovering why I'm drawn to an idea, I don't know right away like why I'm creating what I'm creating. I just know that I'm supposed to, and things keep popping up that like point me in that direction. And then eventually it's like, oh, this is what it is. And so with the last show, all of a sudden I started to notice the parallels between Blackness, specifically African-American people, and homelessness, because African-American people are some of the only people who are essentially a homeless people. Like the country that we are originated in and like born in doesn't want to claim us, but I can't go to the African countries that I'm descended from and feel like I'm necessarily at home. Like there's still nuances that are missing. And so it's this idea of like carving out space and how you create that. So I hope that answered the question. But yeah, that's kind of how I focus on identity and authenticity kind of merging. Okay.
You both answered the question and gave me new questions, so thank you. Nyugen, Rashayla, either of you?
Yeah, I wanted to jump in, but I don't know. I also am kind of curious about your question, because I want to make sure that the discussion is driving forward. So if something that I say pricks a question or something that you're thinking, Niama, I would also love to be in dialogue around that too.
Sure.
So feel free to interrupt is my point.
Yeah, okay. I was like, wait, what does she want me to do? Okay.
We're all passionate about what we do, and I think I'm long-winded and it's easy to get lost. So that's why I'm warning you, and I'm saying you can interrupt me if you need to.
Noted. Thank you.
All right. So I also took a few notes that I wanted to address, because somebody asked a question about what I meant with the statement about using light skin privilege in the work. Before I get to that, I want to stage a little bit what I'm like referring to. Most of my work, whether that's working in the realm of performance, working in the realm of education, working in the realm of as a writer, I'm very interested in the idea of like making people aware of how power manifests in their lives. So in ways that are very mundane, the ways that are spectacular, the ways that are institutional, I'm very interested in all of those manifestations of power. And I think a lot about my role as an educator to help teach people and make them aware of the context that they're viewing an artwork in. A lot of times when we look at a performance work or a film or a movie, we are compelled to disengage from our context and become completely involved in the reality that the artist creates. What I'm trying to do is remind people that we are in a theater, we are in a museum, we are in a historic place that has a lot of trauma linked to it, it has a lot of exploitation linked to it. And so a lot of times I'm trying to draw people's attention to that. So when I talk a lot about power manifesting in someone's life, sometimes I change my appearance slightly for a performance, whether that's in a photograph that's documenting the performance or a video, in order to try to make people aware of the fact that, one, we have malleable identities, and two, that even within a context of me being a Black person looking for my own liberation, that there are intra-community issues that have to be addressed. Primarily anti-queer activity, anti-woman activity, and also the fetishizing of Black women dependent upon their skin tone or their body type. So I know a lot of great women artists like Yana Evans, who uses her very voluptuous body as a way to make a statement about how people objectify and sexualize her, even if she's just walking down the street. And so I think those types of statements are very powerful to make. So I will share an image, excuse me, that a lot of people may have become familiar with from my photography practice. And it's essentially kind of addressing some of those questions. So this image is called "You Can't See Me Fool." And some people are unclear if it's a performance or if it's a photograph. So for me, it's a photograph that actually has a performance. So this document that we see next to it is actually a contract that a collector or an institution who collects this artwork or displays it has to adhere to a certain kind of set of standards that I perceive as needing to be central to the display of artwork of a Black woman. So certain things like making sure to always spell my name correctly and have the entire name of the work the way that I have asked for it, displaying it at the position that I asked for, not reselling it without my approval, and in the event of a resale, I get to say where it goes. So an institution can't sell it to an institution that I don't believe in, for example. A collector can't profit from my work without having to split 50% of the profit for me. And so using an image that's highly seductive with leopard print, it has that kind of aesthetic that people like to kind of consume as art objects. What I'm doing is tricking people into an engagement with a sexy pop culture ready image and having them realize they're getting into a legal arrangement. So part of the life of this image is that I actually just show like all the different places where it's been exhibited as a part of the exhibition of the work. So beyond me just showing like an image of myself, which can become a magazine cover, which it did. So these are just all the different ways that this image had a life once it started to proliferate in the world. It became my most well-known image because it's something that people want to see from Black women artists. They want to see these patterns. They want to see the colors. They oftentimes do exalt people with light skin. And you can see that from the fact that we all kind of refer to Beyonce as the queen of Black creativity, I think is highly problematic. And I think people need to address the fact that she was centralized, not only because of her great singing and dancing ability, but also because of the fact that she is very fair skinned. And I think she herself is starting to become aware of that because her children have more Black features. And now she wants to, you know, kind of be a part of these kind of Afrobeat moments. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about as it relates to light skin privilege. And also relating to educating folks while making a work that might be perceived as a performance. So saying that all to say, and I'll just wrap up here, I'm currently in the PhD program of performance studies at Northwestern University. And a lot of what I'm interested in is also like researching the systems of power around the display of artwork so that I can use my work to challenge those systems. So the contract is just one little piece. So anytime people show my work, they know, Rashayla's gonna come in and start making institutional demands. And that's what I want. I want people to bring me to the table thinking I'm going to be agreeable, nice, you know, sweet artist, whatever. And then that they have to bring all these other people, you know, to work with me. They have to review these contracts. They have to be aware of my humanity. So yeah, so I hope that answers some people's questions, but I will stop there.
Nyugen?
Yeah, I think about the one of the things that I'm really interested also too is just thinking about the as Rashayla was talking about, the fetishization of the Black body. I remember when I was in grad school and I made a performance, and one of my mentors was looking at the documentation, and one of the things that she said to me was, well, you really have to think about, as she's like, I'm looking at many of the people in the audience there, and I know many of them there, and I really think that you need to be very careful about that. It's more about the work than about your body while you're making the work. And that really stood out to me, and it struck me, and I started to kind of process like, okay, so how do I address that? She gave me an essay. It was the Aunt Hester Scream. It was a Fred Moulton piece. And so I went back and I was reading this thing and reading it through many times. As you know, Fred Moulton's text can be quite dense. So extrapolating what I could from that. And then the next performance that I did, what I tried to do with that performance was actually say, okay, how about if I'm introducing the performance essentially with my body present, and then I can actually kind of step back and the performance continues to happen. And that was my strategy for kind of not having my body be the object. And one of the things that was quite interesting after that was a curator who was there, we were talking afterwards, like, I really dig the performance and stuff. I'm going to send you an essay that I think that resonated with me and it made me think of when you're making the performance. And he sent me the very same essay. So it was like one of those moments where I was like, okay, I think I'm tapping into something here. But it was a very real and important point that was made to me. And to this day, it's one of the things that I think about very much so, as well as this idea of what is the future of performance for me. And that future is the blurring of the lines between theater, performance art, and ritual. And I remember, like I said before, when I began making performance, and people said, "Oh, it's so much like theater." I said, you know what? Well, okay. Started to read text. Denenge Akpem Deist, who was one of my professors in grad school, my mentor and friend. One of the texts she assigned me was Black Theater, Ritual Performance in the African Diaspora, and that text changed everything for me. And one of the things that it did was really just kind of help me to understand and to see the richness in the history of performance in the Black diaspora, pre-performance art, of the 1960s, et cetera. So that is the thing for me as I think about the future. It's about blurring these lines between the theater space, what seems magical. Yesterday in your talk with Raianna C and Dom, they mentioned the creating fantasy in real life. And that's another thing that I'm really fascinated by and excited to do. So one of the things that one of my devices or one of my objects or symbolism that I use in that is bubbles. I love bubbles, and I use bubbles in the performances. The way that I see them is in these other worlds, and as well as thinking about the magic that bubbles essentially kind of hold. They hold light, they hold air, they hold space, and then they're gone. And so that's one of the things that I incorporate in the work, and continue to add all of these other layers of symbols to the work. So essentially 10 years from now, I can create like an index of the vocabulary that's involved in my performances and such.
Wonderful. I think thinking and looking at what you've all said thus far, one of the things that I'm thinking about is this idea of portals, and this idea of your work, creating them or fashioning them in such a way that it's not just about the performance in the moment, but kind of carrying forward all of these various connections, particularly for you, Nyugen. I'm thinking about, I have a question that may be like a little personal, but I'm wondering about, you sort of referenced it in a way that was like, not, you didn't name it, but I wonder about what this spiritual tradition that you were referring to, that you saw growing up was.
Yeah. It's spiritual Baptist.
I thought
so,
that's
yeah.
Me
yeah,
too.
So,
I understand.
Yeah. Oh, right on.
Okay.
Yeah. So for those who don't know, if
Yeah.
you want to tell them a little bit about it, you can.
Like, is my mother somewhere nearby? Okay. So for context, spiritual Baptist tradition is something that you find mostly in the Caribbean. If you live in Brooklyn or like a neighborhood where you find a lot of Caribbean people, the women with like the elaborate head ties and the very sort of, how would you describe the dresses?
Usually, usually one solid color.
Yeah.
And very similar to what you may see people wearing in the that served in the houses during slavery.
Woo.
Right, they wore the whites, and they would have an apron on. Like when I started to see those imagery, those things came together for me in very real ways.
Yeah, that just made me get like really warm when you said that.
Yeah.
Ooh, okay.
Head ties and such. Yeah.
And I even, so for context, this conversation is not about me per se, but I will say that, so I studied migration and diaspora studies very intentionally as a sort of entry point into my curatorial practice. And among that, so I did that at SOAS in London. For anybody that knows, SOAS is like a very specific place, a very niche place in terms of thinking about the world in a very certain way. So I studied culture and society of West Africa. And one of the things that we looked at was the hauka. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of this. Like, it's basically like a fetish cult in West Africa. And so much of like what they do reminded me of that spiritual Baptist tradition. And I was just like, holy shit. And I feel like so much of it, like, I don't know, where did you grow up, Nyugen?
I was born in Jersey City in New Jersey, and I spent the early part of my childhood in Trinidad.
Okay. So, I mean, what you find in the spiritual Baptist churches in Trinidad versus what exists in Brooklyn may be a little different. But I do think you still have that reverence to like colonial elements in a way. And it's so trippy because I feel like looking at it, I see us trying to like work against history and repair so much of like what was done in the context of the 19th century, the early parts of the 20th century, looking at all of those histories, all of those connections. Like I remember I used to go to this church as a child in Brooklyn, and you know, you have Indians reference, you have Chinese people reference. Those spirits were as valued as, you know, what you would think about in terms of what's revered in terms of the Christian Bible as well. So it was really like, of course, at the time I was like 12 or something, so I didn't like put it together in that way. But I just wonder about how spirituality for each of you finds its way into your practice. These ideas that are actually much more complex than just the spiritual elements. I don't know if that made any sense. No? A little bit?
Basil, your mic is mute.
It made sense.
Thank you.
Well, I think outside, like going a little further, just thinking about the work that I've seen from Basil, the work that I've seen from Rashayla, the work that I've seen recently from Raianna, in thinking, you said one thing about repair, as you were just speaking, and I think that there is an element of repair that's happening, or the identification of the need for repair, repairing something in all of our practices, whether it's the way that we think of institutions, and the way that institutions, the harm that institutions have done, or things that they continue to perpetuate, whether it's a personal a reparation that happens within the person, or also thinking about our collective, right? So thinking about the way that we've been indoctrinated into something, and as a result of that, there is some sort of harm that's done, rupture, and this and then the way that we're thinking about the work, and some of the works that we're making is intentionally to fracture that which has been set in place that has been causing this kind of harm and pain, essentially. So this is how I'm thinking. As you said, repair, and that work really struck me.
So coming back to this portal idea. So thinking about what each of you are doing as portals of repair, portals of restoration.
I'm gonna steal that, by the way. Portals of repair. I like that.
Just quote me. That's all I ask.
No, I'm gonna quote you. I'm just saying I'm gonna use that.
You do what you need to with it. That's the point. That's why we're here. That's why we do this work, to exist in conversation and community with each other. Because, you know, as they say, one hand can't clap, right? So we are having to draw. And also, I guess Fahamu knew what he was doing when he asked me what he gonna say in the comments. I'm gonna see. Yes, Rhonda, I saw you note your trininess earlier. And also shout out to Eric Guzman. I just did a studio visit with him. He's a MFA student at RISD, and I feel like he's now kindred, and he's here asking questions and noting things. So shout out to you. But
before
sorry?
I was gonna say, before we move to the next question, I would say something.
Oh, we're not going anywhere yet.
Oh, okay. Because I was gonna say I would say something about that spiritual component.
Yeah, we're not going nowhere yet.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Stay with me. So my first exhibition opened like 4 years ago. It was actually like the initial idea came about in 2014. So the show was called Black Magic, Afro Past, Afro Future. So ultimately thinking about this idea of epigenetic memory and us kind of drawing from the well of something together, whether, you know, across context, whether you're in Ethiopia, whether you're in Nigeria, whether you're in Brooklyn, whether you're in Bamako, whether you're in Kingston, whatever, there is something that we are pulling from. And it isn't just happenstance. It's not just about colonialism. It's not just about pushing against white supremacy. There's something germane to who we are that sort of like requires us to do what we do. And I wonder about how you all see, going back to this portal idea of kind of putting all of this together, how do you work through that? Are you thinking about that actively? Is that something that you sort of look back and realize, oh shoot, that's what I'm doing? Like, what do you think? So Basil, go ahead with your question or comment.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess to this first part, like there is a process of excavation for me where I'm like digging deeper and deeper, because I think a lot about genetic memory and just like all the things that are held in the body. And
I also want you to talk about your quilts within that.
Yeah, okay, we can fold all that in too. But just thinking about how like so much is stored in the body itself. And when we think about healing, often in the Western context, you know, there's a lot of like talking therapy, which is valuable, but there's also so much to do with like, how do we access, communicate, and then release or process information that's stored in the body. And that's somehow, I didn't mean to say somehow, but that is what leads me to performance, because it's like, how can I activate my body to unlock some of these things and feel some of these things more deeply? When we think about the spiritual component, like I grew up in the church, you know, my parents were Baptist. I grew up in the Baptist church, and we did all the stuff. I sang in the choir. My dad was a preacher for some time, and I was never good at singing, but they had me up there mainly so I wouldn't fall asleep. But I think I fell asleep a couple times at the choir stand too. But all that to say that like there's some things from that experience that like are deeply rooted within me. And then too, like I also draw from some Eastern modalities, and then with my own personal life and what I'm noticing happening in my performance is that I am reaching for a type of spiritual life that I know has existed within whatever expression of my being that I am now has existed before, but I have somehow been removed from, but it's still there. So it's like, I guess there's like three parts where it's like I'm also creating my own spiritual life that doesn't have to be a part of anybody's religion. It's just me connecting with what I understand to be my spirit and the larger source all at once. And then how it relates, I guess, to the quilt work is that, you know, quilting has been a part of my family for generations. That was like actually when I started making quilts, that was like what really got me into this line of thinking around genetic memory, because I hadn't given it that much thought before. But when I started sewing, it was like my hands already had the muscle memory to do it. It was so bizarre. Like, you know, like I had a friend showing me how to use the sewing machine, and she was like, I don't even know why I'm teaching you. It's like, you already know how to do this. And then like, even when I had people showing me different techniques by hand, it's like, it just makes sense. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Like I grew up drawing and painting, and I learned it and I became good at those things, but it wasn't second nature. When I started making these quilts, it was like second nature. Like, I don't even know how to describe it. It's like angels in the outfield. Like I had help doing it, you know, and like sometimes when I'm like not really connected with myself or not really feeling like working, I'm like, oh, let me go put a few hours in the studio. It may not feel like I have all that additional spiritual assistance, but like when I do take the time to like, I've been like meditating before my art practice and just like taking this time to like really connect with my body and connect with, you know, using art as a way, using the art making process as a way to connect with this gratitude for my spiritual life and for the energy that allows me to be a vessel. I like how Nyugen used that word. It's something I think about often too, just being a vessel for this art to come through me. So it all, like the art, the exercise, it all feels very like braided into like what I understand as my own spiritual life. You know, it's like all of these different aspects help me understand myself and then relate to the world around me. So that may come out in performance. It may take the form of a quilt, but it's all this kind of like sifting away to like get to just the source below, you know?
Can I respond to that? I really love that.
Please.
Yeah, I really love that idea of the work that you make as an artist being kind of braided into the practices and the rituals. I mean, even though you were saying like earlier, this practice has been a lot of like you kind of learning to take care of yourself, and you thought that that was like maybe a oversimplifying. I'm like, no, actually, I think that's a really beautiful and complicated way to engage with the practice of making art. And I think that's one of the things that makes performance-based art so valuable, is that it shows us all kind of like how the things that we do every day do have like a performative element to them. And in my own life, like speaking about like religion, like I was really pretty sure I wanted to become a preacher at one point in my life. Yeah, I was raised mostly Christian, and when I say mostly, I don't know if some people would consider Jehovah's Witnesses Christians because of the way that they approach the word, but I think they do, obviously. But I think in general, you know, I had different portions of my upbringing raised in Catholicism, Jehovah's Witness, Baptist, spiritual Baptist kind of tradition, and AME. So whatever I knew I wanted to somehow be a Christian minister of some kind. And then as I got older and I actually read the entire Bible, it was really a challenge for me because I, as a scholar, could see that there were a lot of discrepancies. There were a lot of kind of incomplete references and things that showed that the text had been kind of modified quite a bit over time. And so that was something that I didn't really feel that comfortable with. And so I started to explore a lot of other religious traditions, including spending some time reading the Quran, spending some time reading different types of Buddhist texts. And I actually was a practitioner of Nichiren Buddhism for quite some time. I wouldn't say that I consider myself a Buddhist or a Christian or any particular ideology of religion, but I like to study and explore them because they do have embedded in all of them this orientation towards ritual and this orientation towards actually being aware of the ways that the actions of your bodies and the actions of your you know, kind of presence with the spirit or God, you know, actually can be enacted through a set of actions with other people. And that's actually something that's brought me to a lot of African traditional religions as well. Specifically, I've been interested in Lukumi, which is also known as Santeria, but a lot of people in the tradition perceive that as a derogatory name for it. But thinking specifically about the melding of religions and the melding of cultures that manifest through Black spiritual practice. Like the way we practice Christianity is not the way the white folks practice Christianity. And even the way we practice Buddhism a lot of times is very different than the way that other folks practice Buddhism. And so thinking a lot about how we use our ancestral knowledge and cultural history to engage it as a kind of artistic practice of culture, that's something that's also very fascinating to me. So yeah, so I just wanted to jump on that because I was really inspired to respond to it.
I'm right here with you, yeah.
Awesome. So we are kind of pushing up against some time. Did you want to jump in, Raianna?
Yes, but it's long. My answer is long.
I mean, I feel like go for it.
Let it rip.
Okay, where do I start? Okay, so I know you said something about genetic information. That's something that I've been my mom is a microbiologist and a geneticist, so I've been like exposed to this idea of like DNA and RNA and all that stuff since I was younger. And so I've always been fascinated about how that doesn't just work with like physical attributes, which we normally think about, but also just like things like you were saying that are ingrained with you. Like you were talking about making your quilts, how it felt very natural, or like you were stepping into your most authentic self. And I think that movement really allows you to do that in a way that kind of goes past your like conscious mind and directly to your subconscious. Like, for example, like yoga, dancing, meditative, like movement practice, Tai Chi, all of that kind of taps into that. And so I think that dance and performance art has a really unique ability to be and exist in that space. And so one thing I also began to notice was that other creatives that I didn't know would create things, whether it's choreographers or artists, that were very similar to what I was creating at the time. And so why is it that if I do something in my movement that's like this because it feels right for what I'm creating, that if I look at work from an artist in I don't know, Italy, they're doing the same thing, even though we may not be talking about the same thing, there's something to that I think is really important.
Consciousness.
Yeah, there's like this collective feeling going on that we're tapping into. But I think that applies not just to trauma. I think we talk a lot about genetic information when it comes to trauma, but it also can apply to joy and love and spirituality and all these other emotions. And that people kind of, I don't know, run from that idea, especially Eurocentric art tends to run from that idea, because then you're on this thought path that our culture does not exist in spite of whiteness, but rather it exists in a space that's affected by it. And so because we're still tapping into these things that are joyful, it's like we don't exist just because of oppression or just because we were made to feel lower or be lower class citizens. And when you tap into that spirituality and that, I guess, like flow, for me personally, when I'm creating, sometimes it doesn't feel like I am in charge anymore. And my dancers have to deal with that because I'll start to move really, really fast. And I'll be like, I don't know, you just gotta pick it up. Or there'll be moments where like synchronicities happen that don't necessarily make sense. Like I'll create something to a song and it doesn't feel right. So I'll turn on another song and start it randomly. And then it just fits, like timing and everything. And it'll crux when it needs to and slow down when it needs to. And I think in those moments, it feels like something else is speaking through me. And I think it's tapping into that collective consciousness and collective feeling. I'm gonna go to my next page. And so with my dancers and with my company, I think the goal, so I can create work that's authentic and movement that's authentic. But if I'm working with an artist or with a dancer who's not able to reach that place yet, it's not going to read, and it's going to enter that inauthentic and more feel like a caricature type of space. So I push them a lot in that way. We do lots of like talking and rehearsal and answering questions and like tough questions, especially for my dancers who aren't Black, who are now approaching this from a different experience than what I am, but it still has to be authentic. I don't want them to take on my experience. And so I think when you're able to get artists to tap into their spirit, both past, present, and future, and bring themselves fully into it, then that's when your audience can also feel comfortable bringing their full spirit into it. And that's when, at least for me, our best work happens, like with the company, is when everyone is kind of like fully there. And so, okay, this is the last thing. And I think that this happens at like really spiritual places, no matter what religion or spiritual practice you're focused on, there's always some type of movement, whether the movement is focusing on being still or focusing on, I don't know, I grew up Baptist, so there's a lot of movement that happens there, which isn't necessarily seen as like a a practice movement, but I think that it is. And there's not like a technique to it, but there is a technique to it, to finding that release. And that happens in church and with yoga for some people, but that collective coming together of spirits that are being authentic with themselves where they are in that moment, I think is really, really powerful. Yep, that's it.
I love all of that.
I was just thinking about, when you just said the collective, I was thinking earlier about this panel and about the other panels that I was a part of prior to this. And I just really am glad during this time of how this is happening amongst our community, and that we're coming together in this way. I feel like before this period of time, we're kind of in these silos. At least for me, I experienced it in that way. And we were doing our thing in that way, and primarily like operating in a lot of white spaces, and facing, you know, some of the struggles that we're sharing here today, and that I've heard people share throughout this period of time. And so yeah, I just want to celebrate this kind of the way that we're here collectively now, sharing in the ideas, talking about our work, seeing the through lines in our practices. And I really hope that this continues in such a way of support, and continue to work together in such a way after, you know, things, people start to be able to move around a little bit more. Just remember what we're exchanging at this time. Yeah.
I mean, I feel like I'm growing so much just from this one call. Like, I'm like, damn, I want to study each one of y'all even deeper. And yeah, I'm feeling moved, like just invigorated. You know, I've been training towards a new performance piece, but like this got me fired up. It's like, okay, let me really develop this thing, you know?
Aw, I love you so much. Okay, so we have 2 questions in the Q&A. I feel like one of them kind of have answered, but the other I feel like is sort of more pertinent for the sort of development of more thoughts for those who are listening. So Eric Guzman has asked, "Hola everyone, thank you so much for speaking about your practice and work. Rashayla, as a lighter complexion first generation queer Latinx artist in academia, I realize my privilege has afforded me so many things just due to the shade in my skin. What literature would you recommend on colorism, or what does everyone support one Afro-Latinx work to view? Also, Rashayla, can we see a copy of that contract? Because there's an emoji and this is an old computer, so I assume that's a fire emoji. Tell me if that's right. Muchísimas gracias, Eric Guzman."
All right, so I have to be honest, I need to like dig a little bit, but I will follow up with personally, Eric, to recommend some readings on that. I think my immediate impulse is not writing about colorism, like that's the subject matter of the book, but I'm very interested in the narratives of people who escaped from slavery, fugitives. And a lot of
fugitivity is everything.
And fugitivity is right. Is where you see a lot of light-skinned African Americans using their proximity to whiteness to, so I don't know if you saw that movie, the movie about Harriet Tubman that came out, I think last year. There was a scene where there was a fair-skinned woman with them, and she pretended to be the son of the slave owner, and she successfully hid the other slaves, the other enslaved people, excuse me, because the white people, when they saw her, they thought she was white. That is actually a scene. I'm sorry, it's feeding back. Can somebody, I think maybe Raianna, you might need to mute, unfortunately. Sorry, yeah, thank you. That's actually based on a scene of 2 different actual slave narratives. One of them would be Harriet Jacobs, who was able to disguise herself, and actually she darkened up with some, I think it was like coal or powder or something. And then she also had like a man's jacket. So the idea of like disguising yourself, they were looking for a person who they thought would pass for white, because Harriet Jacobs was actually kind of fair-skinned like me. So the way that they kind of, the slave owners posted about her was assuming that she would want to be white. So people were looking for a light-skinned woman with her hair straightened and with a petticoat on, instead of a Black man who looked like a sailor.
Ain't
So-
that something, first of all, before we continue? That's something. That's
Right.
really something.
So that's one story. And there's another one, The Crafts, where Ellen Craft dressed as the white male owner of her husband, who was dark-skinned, and they traveled by train to freedom. So she wore a patch, and she had she pretended to be disabled as well. And so people wouldn't interact with her, and they would interact with her slave, which was her husband, and he was there to protect and make sure that she could walk as the master. So I think that those stories for me are really important to talk about the role of skin color as it pertains to the idea of racial designation and fugitivity. For Afro-Latinx people, I know that there have to be some scholars that are specifically talking about that. Yes, Firele Baez, yes, she's a really good artist, I think, to talk about that, because she also talks about the relationship between, she calls them the sisters, which are basically like the representation of Dominican Republic and the representation of Haiti. And a lot of times the sisters are in a warring kind of confrontation to each other, but sometimes they're intertwined and their bodies are leaning on each other. So I think looking at her work is a really great, yes, Coco Fusco, thank you, Deborah. These are some great people to talk about the role of skin color as it relates to Afro-Latinx identity. I think there was another thing about the contract. So the contract is actually up on the website for my work, and you can see it in detail underneath the link for the art there. So you'll be able to actually see the contract. But that contract is not super unique. I think if you're interested in artist contracts, you should look at the contracts written by Seth Siegelaub and Bob Brzezinski, which is one of the earlier contracts designed to destabilize the auction market. And I think for Black artists who are selling art, to sell your work without a resale clause is basically asking for yourself to be exploited on the auction market, just like your ancestors were. And I think that's something that we don't talk enough about, especially since there's a lot of very visible Black artists who are selling work on the auction market. We need to start talking about the resale clause. So that would be like a good template, and also Wage, the organization that is working for artists to be paid properly. I believe they have a standard contract as well that they work with. So I will go to the Wage website and see if they have some information that you can dig up for working with institutions.
Amazing. Does anyone else have thoughts they want to share per that? Not really. No?
I just agree 100% about the contracts. I mean, I know I actually like the way you use it as a work of art also. But yeah, all of my original work goes out with the resale clause, because I mean, I'm just trying, I like to imagine the long term, and I don't want somebody putting the wind in my sails and then taking it out without my, so I'm just cheering for your choir. That's all I'm doing. But yeah, I like that as a work of art. I was actually wondering if you had ever sold like a contract as a work itself, or if it's only like an accompaniment to other works. But the way you had to display it, I was like, man, that would be dope to just sell the contract as a work, with another copy of itself.
There's an artist who does that, and he won. He's one of those Black artists that nobody, I think, knows is Black, and he's under the radar. He has like no social media presence, but he won a MacArthur Genius Grant last year, and he's like 32. His name is Cameron Rowland. We're all gonna start knowing more about Cameron Rowland's work, because he just got $600,000 from MacArthur. I'm imagining he's gonna be doing something pretty big with that money. His work is about using his work as a contract to rent works that were made by people in the prison industrial complex to collectors. So they rent it at cost, and then they have to give it back to him. And so just even raising that question,
I fuck that so heavily.
Brilliant.
Brilliant.
So into Cameron's work.
That's so great. So we have a final question. And actually, I've been thinking about documentation, because I think even in the conversation yesterday, Nyugen, that you brought up this idea that like sometimes there's not an audience. So what then, or are you thinking about documentation for archiving? Like what is your thought process around documentation in general?
So first and foremost, the documentation, I always think about someone said to me once, when you find someone who documents your work in the way that you see, it's that you really, really like the way that they document the work, stick with them. And the way that I process that is that the person, like, so for instance, a friend of mine, his name is Pascal Bernier, and whenever I can bring him to document my work through photography, I do, because the way that he captures my performances is the way that I see it happening in my head. And so whenever you find someone who's able to get your work like that, try to stick with that person first and foremost. That's for me. And then the next thing is, yeah, video documentation, photographic documentation, and whether that's ever shown to anyone else, that's another story. But it's just to have it as a record of the work being done, as well as something that I can learn from. And then the next thing is the ephemera. So objects that have been used, remnants of things that have been used throughout the performance. It's like, I keep those things, I label them, they go in boxes, and, you know, keeping those things. So I think that's too, the documentation, whether it's video and or photography, as well as the ephemera, and just like really cataloging it, because sometimes a lot of these things can get put in the mix of other stuff, get lost, and that kind of thing. So that's how I think about it.
Anyone else?
On the documentation piece. So I have like a few guidelines that I follow in terms of like if I'm gonna let other people document the work, and a lot of the stuff I document myself, but like one of my rules that I only let people that love me photograph me, like for artwork. You know, like a friend can take a casual picture, but like if we're making art, like and it doesn't have to be romantic love, but I have to know that you love me for the way that you look at me to come out a certain way. So that's one of my kind of documentation rules. I do a lot of my own documentation though, because I know I love me, so that way I can kind of just get straight to it. But yeah. And I also agree with Nyugen's approach, and I'm gonna expand into that because I feel like video, you know, I don't have a whole lot. I don't know as many video folks. So when I find somebody that can essentially speak my language, I'll take that too. But I guess the way I have been thinking about it is like, you know, I want someone to look at me lovingly when they're behind the thing.
Yeah, just real quick on that. I've been working with the same film team since 2016. And again, yeah, people who love you, care about you. I know these people care about my well-being. So it's a husband and wife team that does production for documentaries. And they first offered to do my performance Raised to Master. And since it was so beautiful, I've let them do pretty much every performance since then. And I pay them. I try to pay them fairly with what I get paid. And sometimes I try to get the institution to pay them. I think that's important that performance-based artists put that in their contract, that documentation from the institution, and if you have a person, that they pay that person directly. So a lot of times I just have more money going to Jason and Jean on top of my, you know, stipend being paid directly to me. And I think that's a strategy for making sure more of us are in these institutions. And I think that's a good thing to write into your contract too, documentation.
And that documentation goes to you also. Mm-hmm. Critically important. So 4 more questions, just following up in thinking about documentation. So I actually, not a lot of people know this, but I have like an ongoing performance project that I've been doing called the Circle of Trust. And so it's very much literally about healing. It's very much thinking about these modalities within the diaspora that work around like inner circle, and also inviting multiple performance and ritual modalities into that space. But I don't document it beyond like recording the sound of it. There's no video, there's no photographs, because I just don't think like it's one of those, you had to be there. If you wasn't there, then you wasn't there. But do you all sort of resist documentation at all? Now, within that resistance, is there resistance, as Fahamu has put it in the chat, resisting the gaze or empirical notions of the archive and documentation?
When I reject documentation or specifically exclude it, it's less about, well, I guess it's less about the imperial gaze and more about people being entirely present in the moment. But I guess the gaze can impact, and often does impact, whether or not someone is able to be entirely vulnerable and present. Like it's a little harder to, you know, let go when someone's watching you try to let go, you know? So when I normally reject performance, is to amplify the connectivity component. And I think that that is often a worthwhile sacrifice. So like what I've done to get around that is I might have one documented session and then multiple reiterations. And I like reiterating the same performance multiple times to make it even more ritual, because it's like repeated. So the majority is undocumented, which is tough in terms of like building. That's why I think my performance is less known in terms of like the pillars of my work that people recognize. Is probably like quilts first, and then collages, and then performance, because you know I don't have film of all the pieces. But I think that like when we're speaking about healing and this interpersonal connectivity, I'm willing to sacrifice documentation if it's gonna let the people involved be more united.
I feel that. For me, not that you were asking me this question, but
No, I love that back and forth.
I think, like, yeah, I don't, for me, so much of what the Circle of Trust is about is improvisation. And I think in keeping with what you just said, Basil, like it's so much more about being in the moment. Certain, you know, this idea of like the cool, right? So like you don't get to the space of the cool if your head isn't on straight, if your head is not cool, which is of course like a Yoruba idea. So like you can't do that if you're like looking through a camera, because you're not even looking with your own eye in a certain way, right? So yeah, it just for me feels better, and it also fosters a space for improvisation if everybody is focused on whatever is happening in that room, rather than like thinking about what the documentation is going to do in the future. Does that make sense? Anyone else?
I'm kind of on the other end of the spectrum, I think, where it's like I overdo the documentation so that there's a proliferation that destabilizes the idea of point of view. Because I'm very interested in the idea of the gaze. Like I'm not trying to destabilize it. I'm just like, we're doing it, and now I want to use that as a material and play with it. The idea that people are looking at me, they're expecting something. So a lot of times I actually ask people to take out their phones during a performance and start making things that can be used in future video renditions of the work. So a lot of times it's like I have this piece where I have this thing called Call the Ancestors, and it's kind of tongue in cheek. We're literally using our phones. So it's like using the idea of like calling spiritually. So I call a person on the phone who has a voice that sounds like she could be my ancestor. And then I talk to her and ask her questions about the past, while other people bring out their phones, and then they're also like documenting or live streaming this at the same time. So it's a very weird, comical, strange, uncanny spiritual experience that's kind of disrupting the idea that I can have control over people's, ways of seeing.
Perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I mean, like within the circle is literally a circle. So there is not like one point of view that's being privileged. And so I feel like documenting that, like you can't, because it's a circle, literally. Yeah. So it's, but I feel you. And I like that a lot, actually.
That makes me want to play with that more too, because I kind of do like go to the other end, but I'm learning. I'm like, okay, let me see how that feels.
Nyugen, you got nothing?
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about lately is the one in terms of the gaze, I do think about the camera as those images, which will then bring people closer to the work. So for instance, people who are there physically witnessing the performance, and they're taking the images and then they're posting those things. So being constantly aware of the camera as they are also an image maker, which helps with the proliferation of the work, as Rashayla was saying. I think about that in terms of like theater. So for instance, understanding where your body is in relation to the audience that's there during performance, it's also that same kind of relationship, and looking at the camera as one of the audience as well, but also to everyone there as image makers, right? And then one other thing just wanted to touch on too, which I'm starting to learn a little bit more about as it relates to archiving, is the encoding of our images. So over time, technology changes. And in order for the images to essentially continue to be relevant through the technologies as they evolve, there's like ways to be able to go into the encoding of the images. And this is something I just recently heard about, and I'm going to be spending some time actually with Marvin Fabian, my collaborator, I told you, because this is one of his researches that he's been doing. But I think it's important that all of us start to think about the encoding of the images digitally as well, so that they are able to be brought up in searches in ways that you would not have imagined. So it's something to think about.
Oh, you mean metadata? And that
metadata, and there's something else besides the metadata, because that wasn't the first thing that came to my mind when I brought to him, but he's like further than metadata. So
brilliant.
Yeah,
thank you for that. I think that's about it today. This has been amazing. I'm so grateful to have had this conversation with the four of you. Thank you again, Fahamu, for inviting me back to join for ADAMA Salon again. I don't know if anybody has like final thought that they want to share.
I'm just super thankful. I just want to, I guess I'll share like a little story. So when I first got on Instagram, Fahamu was one of the very first people to ever follow me, one of my first 100 followers. And he stuck with me the whole time, like, years. And I've just have been looking up to him. So like when he reached out for this, it was just like this major kind of full circle moment for me, where I was like, damn, like somebody I've been looking up to for all this time is like recognizing me and my work. And so I'm just thankful to be here. I feel honored to be with y'all. I'm learning so much, and I'm gonna be like keeping up with y'all. So I just feel blessed to have been in this round table, and super thankful.
And same here, Fahamu. Like I've been, a fan of his work for a long time. And I was teaching high school from 2008 to 2016. And in 2000, I think it was 14, he had a show in New York. And I took some students to see the show, and they were just all over it and stuff. And then I asked him if he would if he would visit the students virtually, have a little conversation, and talk to them about the work like a couple days later. And he generously did that. So just to be in conversation with each other. Rashayla, when I went out to do my MFA, she came to do studio visits with me. And so it's just a wonderful, wonderful to be in all of our presence here today. So word up.
Okay, yes. I'm gonna cry if we don't end this now. Delphine said yesterday I cry all the time. It's true. Okay, no, I'm totally serious. So that we got.
I cry.
Me too.
What you said?
I said I cry easy.
Yeah, it's a problem. Well, maybe not. Also, I kind of feel like, I know we're supposed to finish, but like Fahamu, I feel like we didn't talk about your performance, but I feel like we should, but it might be. That's a whole other discussion, perhaps. Okay, I'm crying.
He said another time.
What is it? Another time.
Another
yeah.
time.
Okay, I gotta go because I'm gonna cry.
Okay. Look,
thanks, everybody. So looking forward to staying in touch with all of you. Thank you, everyone, for your incredible comments and questions. For all of you for your insight and your thoughtful way of working through this conversation. So thank you so much. Bye.
Bye. Thank you
all. It was really great to see y'all today.
All right, take care. Peace.
Definitely.
Yeah.